So up until this point, we haven't really dealt with any server-side programming languages. We've dealt with JavaScript, which is a client-side language, along with data interchange formats like XML, JSON. But PHP is a solid server-side language that is used on many of the popular websites like Facebook, Twitter. It's used a lot, and it goes really well with MySQL, which is a relational database, and we'll be discussing MySQL in the next chapter, and PHP and how they go together. So in this chapter I just want to go through pretty much the basics of PHP and how variables and arrays are created, loops, things like that. So PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, and it was created by a programmer named Rasmus Lerdorf in 1995. Like I said, it's a server-side language, so what that means is that everything is done on the web server as opposed to the client's computer. All the decision making, conditionals, things like that is all done on the server. And it's very handy because it can be directly embedded into HTML by using these PHP tags. So you'd have the opening tag here, and then all the PHP, and then the closing tag. And you can output things. You can echo out values, like say in JavaScript we have the document.write method. In PHP you have the echo. It's free and open source, which is always good. There's a ton of documentation at php.net. It's a loosely typed language. It's not strict like, say, Java or C# or something, or any of those types of languages. And again, it works very well with MySQL, as well as some other database systems, Postgres and Oracle. I think it can work pretty well with. I've never used them. I always use MySQL, but it's pretty compatible. Let's see. It's mostly used with MySQL. It creates a user-friendly interface when dealing with data. PHP can generate web content, or HTML. You can use command line scripting. PHP can be used to build desktop applications, although it's not a popular thing. PHP is it really shines on the web. It can be used as a object-oriented language or as a procedural language. When PHP first came around, it was mostly procedural, but nowadays it's really recommended that you do things in an object-oriented fashion. It's just more secure, it's more reusable, and it's just better programming. So to embed PHP inside an HTML document is extremely easy. Here we have an H1 tag, a paragraph, another paragraph where we have written by, and then an opening PHP tag, and then we're echoing out a variable. Like I said, echo is similar to document.write in JavaScript. It's just going to print something out on the screen. And then we have the semicolon, much like JavaScript, although in JavaScript you don't need the semicolon, in PHP you do. And then we have the closing tag. So it's very easy to embed, which makes it a real desirable language. So variables, loops, arrays, all the programming basics are available in PHP. So pretty much everything that we went over in JavaScript will be going over in PHP. And there's some things just have very little difference, but of course it's important and needed. For instance, a variable needs to have a $sign at the beginning of it. Okay, so in JavaScript this would just be my var. In PHP we need this $sign. Alright, so we can assign strings, integers, arrays, much like JavaScript. Arrays, we can also have associative arrays, which are extremely helpful. So we can create an array and we can give it a key. So we have name as a key and then a value, in this case is Brad. Okay, so it's also known as a hash. If you've worked with Ruby on Rails or some other languages, this is sometimes called a hash. In PHP, they're called associative arrays. Loops, we have for, while, do while, and for each, which is used for arrays. Like in JavaScript, we use a for in PHP, we use a for each. Functions, objects, we can do all that stuff in PHP, and we will be doing all that in this chapter. Object-oriented programming in PHP is it really shines when you use objects. This is an example. Of course, it's a hypothetical example, as we have a class of dog. So all objects they belong to a class. Here we have some properties. Okay, so classes can have properties. In this case, our class of dog has two properties, one of breed and one of color. Alright, so those are properties. Now we can also have methods. Objects have methods. So for instance, we have a method called bark. And by the way, a method is just a function that's inside of a class. It's just a function. And in this case, this function is just going to echo out bark. And you might see these private and public. These are access identifiers. And what this means is if it's private, you cannot access this property outside of the class. Okay? If it was public, you could directly access it. You could assign a value to it or whatever. What's popular to do in PHP is to have your functions or methods be public, and you use a function to access your properties instead of just accessing them directly. So if we want to instantiate an object from a class, we would create a variable, and it would be equal to new and then the class name, which is dog. And then to call a method, we could use the variable and then the dash and then a greater than and then the method name. Alright, so this is how we would call the bark function or method. Okay, and we'll definitely get into more of this as the chapter goes on. So that's the those are the basics of PHP. I think it's easier to show you how things work as opposed to go through a PowerPoint. So that's why I didn't have too much information in this PowerPoint. So in the next section, we'll get into it.